a few years ago, this is how I actually first landed on any of your stuff. I forget what it was. It was a few years ago, and I had expressed like some struggle, something that was weighing on my mind to somebody, and they sent me a link to the Daily Stoic Instagram page.
Yeah.
Right? And they go, do you follow this page? And I was like, no. And they go, oh, they post great stuff like this. And it was a quote.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things where it's just a moment where you read the quote and you're like, oh yeah. Like there was, it was a bit of wisdom that I took in. And I was like, oh, that's a really good one. So I hit follow and, and I would, scroll as we all do. And I would land on those sometimes. And I was like, oh, that's a really good one. And I didn't even realize that there's a person attached to it.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was, somebody posting that stuff. And then eventually I saw your page and I was like, oh, and I didn't even put together at first. I was like, oh, that's that guy. Yeah. Okay. And I started following you, and, I think that, look, most pages I will say are fucking nonsense. It's just, you have one of the few public pages on Instagram where I would say, when you post something, whether it's a quote or a video, you say something, even if it's a brief moment, you provide kind of a brief moment of calmness to me, right?
Yeah,
like where awesome. I go, and I think you probably do for a lot of people where they go, in all the chaos and everything that's going on in our lives and our world, there's a moment where you digest something that you've said or shared, and somebody goes like, oh yeah. And look, you might go right back to your chaos, but it is nice to have these brief moments where you kind of feel like, oh yeah, step back, slow down, or process, or perspective, a different perspective. And you go, oh yeah. And that's how I first came to know you. So it's one of the very few positive Instagram stories out there.
That's so funny. It is weird because I think people think philosophy is this like thing you like study in college, or it's this thing that you do like once, like you have done it,
sure.
as opposed to this thing that you practice, or it's like an ongoing thing.
Christina, she's a philosophy major. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think people tend to think of like people who don't actually have familiarity with philosophy think it's either this like academic discipline, this theoretical thing, or it's a thing that you have studied in the way that's like I studied physical therapy or insert thing, as opposed to this ongoing pursuit.
Yes.
And there's this one interesting letter from Seneca where he's writing to his friend, and it's like 2,000 years ago, and he's basically saying like, I'll give you a quote, you give me a quote. Mm-hmm. And so like they're doing it. Imagine how difficult it would have been to write a letter, to deliver a letter. But they're doing the same thing 2,000 years ago, which is like, I'll give you a quote that's helpful. You give me a quote that's helpful. And he was like, this is what it is. It's like if we get one thing per day that makes us a little bit better, that we think about for 2 minutes, he's like, that adds up. And that's kind of what the daily idea of the Daily Stoic is supposed to be, which I kind of fell into totally by accident.
Would you summarize Stoicism as such?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a philosophy that starts about 2,500 years ago, and it's built around this idea that like we don't control what happens, we control how we respond to what happens, and that everything, all of those responses should be towards these sort of 4 virtues, which are courage, temperance or self-discipline, justice, and wisdom. And so of all the philosophies, it's less this sort of systemic or systematic explanation of the universe and more like this operating system for being like both a good person in the world, but also like a person who's able to survive a shitty, fucked up, complicated, like unpredictable world.
I mean, I would consider you, an expert in this field. Has that helped you survive, hardships and tough moments?
I mean, look, my hardships are privileged compared to someone who doesn't have any arms or legs or was born in, sub-Saharan Africa.
But everybody goes through something. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're like we all have the same limited amount of control over the world that we're in.
And it really is like our depending on how you want to describe it, it's our mindset and our mind frame, our perspective, our view of things that helps you either fall apart or persevere and push through. You have amazing examples of a lot of this in the book.
Well, one of the cool things about Stoicism is like Seneca's, there's the big three in Stoicism, and it's Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius, they actually form like kind of an interesting spectrum. So on the one end, you have Epictetus, who's a slave. He's like, and this is a slave in Rome, like the shittiest place you could be a slave. He literally walks with a limp his whole life because his master just broke his leg for fun. So he's just has like as shitty a life as you can get. He wins his freedom at like 30, and then he's promptly exiled. So like all the bad things that can happen to a person happen to Epictetus. He's like one end of Stoicism. And then the other end, there's Marcus Aurelius, who's not even like born a prince like Prince Charles. Like he's just born this regular kid. His dad dies. And then the emperor goes, I think you should be my heir. And so he's like just chosen, like just a random kid basically is chosen to be groomed to be the most powerful, richest, most famous person in the world. So it's like, as far as extreme ends of the spectrum, it's like everything that could go wrong, everything that could go right.
Is Aurelius chosen by the emperor because of his way of being, as you know, his personal temperance at that age?
I mean, we don't know the exact age that he like sort of comes into the circle, but basically Hadrian is the emperor. He's probably gay, doesn't have any kids. And he, I think, comes up with the idea that like, I could mold someone from scratch to be what it takes to be emperor. Mm-hmm. And so he probably sees something promising in him and then says like, I want to train him to do this thing. And then the interesting thing is he realizes that it's an impossible thing to put on a person that young. So he adopts this guy named Antoninus, who's like in his late 50s, on the condition that he adopt Marcus Aurelius. So they set in motion this chain where when Hadrian dies, Antoninus will be emperor, and then when Antoninus dies, Marcus will be emperor. And he probably thought, you know, Antoninus will rule for 5 years, and then Marcus will become emperor like in his 20s or something. And Antoninus rules for 19 years. Mm-hmm. And so Marcus becomes emperor like late 30s, early 40s.
Which is a good thing.
It works out totally. And they actually got along.
Yeah.
Like even though none of them had any blood relation to each other, and they could have seen each other as rivals or whatever, like Antoninus actually decides, I'm going to help my successor be successful. And then Marcus Aurelius says like, I'm going to actually listen to the person who wants to teach me.
Yeah.
And they have this like amazing, never before, never again, like transition of power.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable.
We don't really see that these days.
No.
It's totally different.
And like, even when there's much lower stakes, you know what I mean? Like
sure.
that Tim Cook takes over for Steve Jobs. You're like, oh, they didn't fucking hate each other. Good for them, you know? And like the stakes are so, like, they couldn't kill each other. They couldn't like get rid of their relatives. Like the emperor had unlimited power. They could put whoever they wanted to death. They controlled the largest empire in the world, the largest army in the world. Like the stakes are enormous.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's supposed to corrupt absolutely. And then there's like 3 exceptions in a row. It's very weird.
Yeah, that's very strange that you would be able to wield that much power and not become an animal. I mean, it speaks to probably how grounded in some way the guys must have been, or they really wanted to rule for the betterment of an entire society, which everybody who runs for office sells that speech.
Yes.
Everybody.
Yeah.
They all are like, I just care about this. And then you're always disappointed in them.
Yes.
Bert and Tom, Tom and Bert. One goes topless while the other wears a shirt. Tom tells stories and Bert's the machine. There's not a chance in hell that they'll keep it clean. Here's what we call 2 bears, 1 cave.